Jai Hind viewers, it's my honor today to host Commodore C. Uday Bhaskar, who's a global icon in the print media and the television media. In 1991, as a newly commissioned officer, was a time when also the Kuwait War took place, and Commodore Uday Bhaskar was on various news channels that time. And it was always my privilege to listen to him because his views were so articulate. And I have no hesitation in saying that he's my role model. And today I feel indeed blessed that Commodore Uday Bhaskar has agreed to come on my show. Thank you so much, sir, and welcome to the Candid Conversation.
Thank you, Jassi. That's a very, very generous introduction. And I just want to say to our viewers that you can see that Colonel Jassi Sodhi is being more than generous in his introduction. I just like to describe myself as one more security analyst who had the privilege of being in the Indian military. So thanks again, Jassi, and all the best with your show. Please go ahead.
So my first question to you is, in a war, there is always a victor or a vanquished. Who, in your opinion, in reference to the Russia-Ukraine war, because this war is in everyone's mind today across the globe, because it has affected everyone in some way or the other. In your opinion, as on date, who is winning this war?
Today is November 10th, 2022, and this war began on February 24. So it is now moving towards its 10th month very soon. And it's a very distinctive war. It's the first major conflict that we have had after World War II, which has involved a permanent member of the UN Security Council, also a nation that has nuclear weapons. And here we are talking about Russia. So it's in many ways sui generis, meaning that there are many aspects and features of this war, which are, I'd like to use the word distinctive again. And as of date, the reason I was underlining November 10th is that today, for the first time, we have an estimate put out by the United States about the casualties sustained in this war. And I was quite struck when I saw the number, because till now, both Russia and Ukraine have released numbers that were below 10,000. In one case, they spoke about 5,000, 6,000 on the Ukrainian side. In Russia, the estimate was 9,000 plus. And today, the US chairman of the Chiefs of Staff, General Miley, put out a figure saying that 100,000 casualties have been sustained both by Russia and by Ukraine. So we're talking about 200,000 killed. 40,000 civilians, apparently, is the estimate. There could be more. And anything between 15 to 20 million refugees who are scattered in different parts of Ukraine and across Europe, perhaps in Russia also. So in that sense, I think this war has not resulted in a clear victor or vanquished, to use your phrase. But I would describe this as an analyst to say that much of the early expectation has been, in a way, belied or not been, in a way, realized. Meaning that when the war started in February, I was among many people who thought that it would be a short, swift war and that Russia would achieve its political objective, because I think we have to keep remembering that every war should have a political objective, especially in the case of Russia. This is a war of choice. Russia decided to embark upon this special operations, as they call it, to invade Ukraine. And clearly, that objective has not been met. And from the Ukrainian side, where many people, including me, felt that they would not be able to resist Russia, which is a former superpower, permanent member of the UN Security Council. And in February, we always said that the Russian military, the army in particular, was a combat-tested army, and that they would be able to achieve their tactical objectives very quickly. That has not happened. So the short point is that in terms of victor vanquished, I don't think they have emerged. But yes, Russia has underperformed. and Ukraine has exceeded all expectations. And that is the stalemate today. Though the Russian retreat, tactical retreat as they are calling it, from Kherson along the Dnipro River is a significant, I would say, punctuation again, because for the first time, whatever I have seen in the Russian media, the Russian defense minister has said that they cannot sustain their logistics, which is why they are carrying out this particular retreat, which is significant from the Ukrainian point of view. So that's not a nutshell. It's the, I would say, context in which we are looking at the war in Ukraine. Jesse?
Thank you, sir. So what, in your opinion, is the likely end of this war, or will it be a frozen conflict like the Armenia and Azerbaijan, which they've been having for so many years?
I think it would not resemble what is happening in between Azerbaijan and Armenia, because that's of a different scale. In the sense that that is local, it does not have the kind of regional and global ramifications that the war in Ukraine is currently having. And I think it would not be allowed to remain a frozen conflict. And the reason I'm saying that is because over the last week, literally, there have been some signs that perhaps some kind of negotiation would commence. And this particular tactical retreat of Russia may allow that particular window. Because at a political level, it's very, I think, instructive again, that for the first time, we hear the Ukrainian president, Mr. Zelensky, has dropped the demand that Ukraine would not enter into any negotiations with Moscow as long as President Putin is at the helm of affairs in Russia. Now, when he stated that, I think many of us thought that this was not a tenable position to start a negotiation, because it is very unlikely that President Putin would either step down voluntarily or that he would be unseated by any of his opponents or critics, because that's not how the Russian system is currently configured. So that seemed to be like a no-go, to say that we will not negotiate if Mr. Putin is in charge of affairs in Moscow. That has not been dropped. So I see that as a sign. And secondly, I think the United States also has indicated that their ability to sustain the kind of support, fiscal, military, logistics, intelligence, is perhaps also reaching a kind of ceiling. And therefore, Ukraine would find it difficult to prosecute this war in the way that it has. And Russia, in turn, is also feeling the fatigue, because the very fact that you had to call up your 300,000 reservists is, I think, an example. And for the Russian defense minister to go public and say that we are unable to sustain the supply chains is an indication, because, I mean, you as an army officer know very well the critical role of sustaining supply lines and logistics in a drawn-out war, which, as I said, will soon enter month 10 by the time we come to December. So that's my reason for suggesting that it will not remain a frozen conflict, and that we might see the beginning of a negotiation, which for sure would be also, I think, encouraged by the other players in this particular war, for instance, the United States. I think Germany may also do a little bit of prodding, because the whole gas issue and Russia's own locus in terms of gas supplies to Europe, all of that is a very big, I would say, factor in how this war is likely to move towards negotiations, perhaps very sullen negotiations. But I don't think we'll see the victor vanquished kind of syndrome that normally follows any major military, I would say, resolution, where there is a definitive asymmetry. One side is lost, the other side is won. And then you move to the negotiating table. And there it's very clear who has won, who has lost, and who's going to pay the heavier price. You have reparations and lots of things are imposed, as we saw in Europe after World War II, for instance. I think that may not replicate.
So what are the major lessons a nation can learn from this Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, I think the most significant lesson to my mind is the fact that there are so many things that we take for granted, the assumptions that we have, either in the case of Russia or in the case of Ukraine, have got to be revisited in a very, very objective way. And I think there are a number of lessons here for India. Now, number one is, for instance, the perception that we had about the Russian military, that it was a very, very disciplined, motivated, trained army, and that all they needed were the directions from the president, in this case, the Kremlin, and that the entire command and control was so well oiled that they would be able to do exactly as the political directive given to them. Now, clearly, if this special operation is something that the Russian military at the highest levels had been planning for a long time, it shows that their plans were not effective and that it's a case of poor planning. If you are not very sure as to what kind of an assault, what kind of an attack you could mount on a neighbor like Ukraine, and what kind of political advantages could be given to the Kremlin by the kind of military, I would say, accomplishment that the Russian military was supposed to deliver. So that did not happen. So if you are actually upset about what Ukraine was doing since 2014, which is what the public record tells us about Crimea, about the way in which Russia had expressed its own unhappiness, it's almost 7 to 8 years that in a way you are planning to carry out a special operations in relation to Ukraine. So I think the entire assumption that you have a good military, a professional military, and that they can actually do this shows that it was not valid. That's, I would say, on the Russian side. Now, clearly, the Russian command and control at the levels that we are talking about, at the general officer level, at the equivalent of the brigade level and the battalion level, and the fact that they were even talking about desertions shows that the morale of the Russian army in particular was not as effective. Let's not forget that Russia, the Navy also lost a ship. Now that also shows that one of their major frontline ships was lost, albeit Ukraine got support in terms of intelligence surveillance from the West. We accept that. But even then, to lose a major principal surface combatant is also, I would say, a kind of indication about the combat efficiency of your Navy. The Air Force, the Russian Air Force was perhaps, you might say that they did not operate in the way that they could have. But at the end of the day, they were not able to make the difference as far as the operation is concerned. This is Russia. On the Ukrainian side, I think what to me was very significant is that in the first few months of the war, though they were the smaller military power, relatively weaker, they got support from the West, but the motivation level of the Ukrainian resistance, both the uniformed community and the civilians who joined at short notice, and carried out an enormous amount of what you might call as the unconventional kind of warfare, particularly in relation to cyber, hacking, being able to disrupt the Russian grid, and also, in a way, scatter their own assets, including, as I read in one report, that they were able to reach out to Mr. Musk and get the Starlink, which enabled them to actually prevent any kind of mass cyber attack by Russia, and various other, I would say, such innovative uses of the other aspects of military power that we all talk about, but we have never seen them being used in combat like Ukraine has used, which is, as I said, cyber, hacking, and the way in which I think they were able to use drones and also, I think, very effectively ensure that Russian armor and Russian, I would say, conventional military was, in a way, not allowed to perform with the kind of efficiency that we associate with them. So this is, I think, a big plus point as far as Ukraine's ability to use these options is concerned. And I think the lesson here is, and I come back to this point, one of the reports I read suggested that fairly early on in the war, Mr. Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, actually invited young Ukrainians from across the world, particularly those who work in the IT sector, information technology, those who are in cyber, those who are into hacking and things of this sort, to actually come and aid the war effort. And he apparently gave full charge to a 20-year-old, for want of a better word, a technical nerd, and made him in charge of this entire, as I said, the cyber and IT-related operation. So that shows, what kind of innovative thinking was going on, and the lessons for a country like India, which is still very rigid in terms of its structures, and we are still talking about a cyber command, is how do you anticipate, in our case, the adversary, whether it's a China or a Pakistan or a non-state actor, what they may do in this spectrum of cyberspace, hacking, etc., and how you can really, in a way, ensure that you are not in a disadvantageous position, and if need be, turn the tables. So that will call for some very objective study of Ukraine's use and Russia's inability to either have a counterfoil or prevent its own assets from being degraded in the way that they were. So these, I think, are two of the primary issues that I would sort of definitely flag, which is to revisit all your assumptions in a very objective way, and also check if the military, which we believe was very efficient, was very professional, what were the causes that led to this performance, which is well below the median, as far as the Russian military is concerned. Chasi?
That was very informative and interesting. So do you think that this nuclear strike is a possibility, or is it mere rhetorics?
Well, I think President Putin, when he made the first reference, and this was then taken up by his foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, and various other senior officials with the Putin team, I think they were putting out, frankly, as they say, nuclear signaling, which I think is unfortunate. I've written about this, and I'm saying this again. Russia is a member of the UN Security Council. It has nuclear weapons. It's a nuclear superpower. And one of the assumptions, or even the tenets, I won't call it an assumption, one of the core tenets after the end of the Cold War, it was inherited from the Cold War, was that major powers, particularly those with nuclear weapons, would not brandish the nuclear weapon for any kind of tactical advantage, much less for territorial advantage or to resolve a territorial issue. You'll remember when Kargil happened in 1999, Mr. Vajpayee was our prime minister. And Pakistan, I think, in a very imprudent manner, tried to invoke or make reference to its nuclear capability. And the entire world at that time, Mr. Clinton was the US president, at the UN in New York, sent out a very clear, I would say, signal and caution to Pakistan that you cannot use nuclear weapons to resolve territorial disputes or anything which is tactical in that sense. And Pakistan backed off. This seemed to be the lesson that was inherited after the end of the Cold War in 91, after Kargil in 99. And for Russia as a superpower, nuclear superpower, to make this kind of, I would say, signal was one that caused a fair amount of dismay. And I think very soon after that, Moscow recalibrated. And then you'll recall that there was a suggestion that almost all the major powers, including India, when Mr. Modi, our prime minister, had told President Putin at one of the summits that this is not the time for war. And even China, in a very oblique way, suggested that they had indicated that nuclear weapons are not to be used. It's a bit opaque what exactly was conveyed to Mr. Putin. But generally, there's not a single voice that said that Russia has a case against Ukraine. The anxiety of the Russian side was that the United States was going to enter and tip the balance, which again, Mr. Biden, the US president, said, no, we have no intention of militarily getting into this war, and so on and so forth. So given all these factors, I would say the probability that Russia would actually use a nuclear weapon, to me, seems at this point low. But let's not forget that Russia has its own narrative. They said Ukraine is doing something very opaque. They are trying to, in a way, signal to us that they would use a dirty bomb, the radioactive weapon. But if you look at the geography, as any military commander who has to finally give that order to use anything atomic, whether it's a tactical nuclear weapon, as it is called, which I don't subscribe to, or there is the radiological weapon that would only end up with contamination, are not viable options, whether you're a Russian planner or a Ukrainian planner, because you would, in a way, be contaminating with atomic waste and radioactive material large swathes of territory which would have to be sanitized and would really become, in a way, unsuitable. We saw what happened after Fukushima, and that was of a much lower order in terms of the anxiety that had been generated. So all these factors considered, my response would be that it is low probability. But then in any war, Jassi, you as a good sapper know that there is the fog of war, and sometimes some very unanticipated things can happen. Is there a non-state entity, which was the anxiety after the end of the Cold War, that some Russian suitcases were missing? You remember they used to talk about the small tactical weapon that Russian formations were supposed to carry in briefcases or suitcases. Is it possible that one of them could actually be used as a radiological weapon on either side? After all, remember, Ukraine had nuclear weapons. Ukraine, at the end of the Cold War, surrendered its nuclear weapons with a very clear understanding from Russia in particular that their territorial integrity and sovereignty would be respected and not threatened in any manner. So this nuclear dimension comes in many layers. Today, if a North Korea is bristling, the lesson they take from Ukraine is that Ukraine is foolish to have given up its nuclear weapons. Look what happened to them. This is what Iran might be thinking. So I think when we talk about the nuclear dimension of the Ukraine war, it comes in a multi-layered way. But will Russia use a nuclear weapon? My answer is very low probability.
And so my final question to you is, which is there on, I think, every global citizen mind. Will a World War III take place?
Short answer is I hope not. I think the world has enough problems with climate change, which is currently being discussed in Egypt. But as an analyst, and I think, this is something you're right, the whole world is concerned. The rumblings that came out of Ukraine in the early stages at different points. And the fact that we are talking about 200,000 casualties. The entire Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, if I remember right, they had lost about 15,000 soldiers. Even that is tragic. For any country to lose young human resource in a war that in many ways resolved nothing. Now, look at the tragedy of Afghanistan. The Soviets lost their troops, so did the Afghans at that time. Then the Americans went in and the NATO. They lost troops. Thousands were injured on both sides. The Afghans sustained the highest casualty rate for any small country. And now, from the Soviet invasion of 1979, look at the tragedy of Afghanistan in 2022 and the extended region. So I want to circle back to your first question about, are they victors? Are they vanquished? I think in this century, that is becoming very difficult to be able to determine in the kind of binary, black and white manner that we did in the previous century. And as of now, I think the probability again is low because the world is weary in terms of prosecuting a world war. And you can see this in all the capitals of the world. They want the Russia-Ukraine war to be resolved on the negotiating table. That can there be a give and take where both sides are dissatisfied? Because today, I think in any territorial dispute, and by the way, this applies to us also, that when we look at our situation, the India-China unresolved territorial dispute, or for that matter, the India-Pakistan, which has a far more complex kind of history, that there is no clear sense of winning and losing. It will have to be approximately equal dissatisfaction on both sides that the political establishment can, in a way, convince or persuade their people to tamp down the nationalism that is now so evident all over the world and accept certain practical realities. So given that the global economy, climate change, and the entire, I would say, disruption that the Ukraine war has already induced, Russia knows it. I mean, look at food, look at fertilizers. We don't even have an estimate about how the poorest countries in the world have been affected because countries don't seem to have the interest or the capacity to really find out what is happening in the poorest parts of Africa or the poorest parts of Asia, which have been directly affected because of disruption to food chains and fertilizer, and climate change is adding to weather patterns, So the world is today in a very, very precarious situation. So I think lurching into a world war is not something that, to my mind, is likely to happen by deliberation. But again, I want to add this caveat as a security analyst that perhaps people were saying the same thing on the eve of World War I, which is more than 100 years ago when we had the assassination of the Archduke there, Ferdinand. World War I happened. We know the preamble to World War II. So I'd be, as I said, keep that rhythm of history in mind but hope that in 2022, there would be a little more prudence on the part of the political leadership of the world before they unleash their militaries. Josie?
So it has been really engrossing and enriching listening to you. I wish, I could have listened to you more, and I'm sure my viewers would have found it equally interesting. But then since time is a constraint, and my sincere thanks to you, sir, my gratitude to you. It has been really amazing listening to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Josie, and all the best with your channel. Good luck.